You know, this evening we were talking about what we stand for here. And you know, when we think about Reformation, something to do about reform, we often think about Elijah. And whenever we mention the name Elijah, probably the most prominent moment that we think of him is standing on top of Mount Carmel. And when he was there on Mount Carmel, this was after 3.5 years of drought in the land, the question that he had was, how long halt ye between two opinions? You had obviously two groups of people there. And even there for him, he, after 3.5 years of drought, he thought that some people would take a stand and remember that Baal is not helping them any. And yet they didn't. And so he told them that, and it says, if the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. And the people still did what? They answered not a word. The issues that Elijah was presenting were not ambiguous. They were very clear. They were very decided. In Prophets and Kings it says, unashamed, unterrified, the prophet stands before the multitude, fully aware of his commission to execute the divine command. His countenance is lighted with an awful solemnity. So here there is Elijah standing there on that mountain among the people there. They threatened him with many things during the last 3.5 years, and he is not ashamed. He is not terrified of anyone there. When we think about the needs of the world today, we're living in a critical time when all these things that are happening, the calamities, the sicknesses, the governmental control, people expecting more governmental control. In this time we need, it says in Malachi 4 verse 5, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Elijah, we're expecting Elijah to come again. And whenever we think of Elijah, there are things that we can think of that are needed today. We look at society today, the collapse of morality. And when we think of that in Prophets and Kings again, it says, today there is need of the voice of stern rebuke. For grievous sins have separated the people from God. The smooth sermons so often preached make no lasting impression. The trumpet does not give a certain sound. Men are not cut to the heart by the plain, sharp truths of God's word. This is the problem that we're finding in society today. Sermons, you know, sometimes people get a little bit shaken up, but what happens a week later? They've forgotten what it was all about. And society needs that today. Now, whenever we look at Elijah, we're thinking of boldness. But there's several things that I want to think about this evening that made the work of Elijah, made him bold and made him successful, because that's what we're looking for. The first question here is, how did Elijah prepare for the work of Reformation? He didn't just go and start doing something and there was success. No, there was a work of preparation. And secondly, why did he wait 3.5 years? I mean, even 1 year, it was pretty bad. A drought, if you're living in a place that has a drought, especially where there's limited water. Imagine here, no rain for the next year. Well, what happened to Virginia? I mean, you don't have rain for a week and they think it's a drought. 2 weeks, it's a severe drought. Okay, imagine a year. Anyway, I'd like to look at some of these things here today. When we look at Elijah, first of all, let's consider where he actually comes from. It says, Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead. And so if you look at the map, there's the Jordan River there. You can see the Sea of Galilee way up north, the Dead Sea way down at the bottom there. And that where that dot is, that is where you find Gilead. It was on the other side of the Jordan River. It was not a prominent place. There was no prominence there. If you look there, far removed from any city of renown, occupying no high station in life, Elijah the Tishbite nevertheless entered upon his mission, confident in God's purpose to prepare the way before him and to give him abundant success. It's interesting, I travel quite a bit, and oftentimes some people are concerned about what's going on in society, what's going on in the church. And they present to me, what are you going to do about it? And I ask them, what are you going to do about it? And they said, oh, I'm a nobody. Have you ever thought who Elijah was? I mean, today we think of Elijah as a major person, but Elijah actually in that context, was a nobody. Never heard of him before. Not even introduced in the Bible. There's no family genealogy to go back and say, okay, he comes from this prominent family. Nothing is known about this man. But we do know he had no high station in life. He did not come from a well-known place. And yet, he began his mission how? Confident in God's purpose to prepare the way before him. What do we need today? When it says in the before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord will come what? The prophet Elijah. From where? From where?
Nowhere.
Obviously, in that context, from nowhere. And who was he?
Nobody.
A nobody. But he was willing to be used by God. The question is, are you willing to be used by God? And it's such a cop-out. You know, when people identify problems and are not willing to do anything about it themselves, that's not integrity. Anyone can tell you there's a problem. A child can tell you there's a problem. Yeah? We don't need to know problems. We know there's problems. What do we need? We need solutions. How do you get solutions? Let's take a look a little bit here about Elijah. When you look at the preparation that he had for his ministry, we can actually see in Hebrews chapter 11, it gives a list of, because Hebrews chapter 11 is a chapter of what?
Faith.
Of faith. And it gives a list of different people and of the what? Prophets, including who? Including Elijah. Who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions. What is necessary in preparation for the work that we have today, for the work of Elijah the prophet? What do we need? Faith. We don't need a high station in life. We don't need ordination. We don't need, you can give a list of what we don't need. What we do need is faith. That is something that is necessary. The word of faith and power was upon his lips. And I want you to pay attention to this. He did not begin his life work when he stood in front of Ahab. That's not what he did. It says, and his whole life was devoted to the work of reform. Before Elijah showed up on Ahab's threshold there on his doorstep, what was Elijah doing? How much time did he spend on it? His whole life. His was the voice of one crying in the wilderness to rebuke sin and to press back the tide of evil. This is the work of Elijah. What was he doing all those years? What was Elijah doing? It's interesting, because when we're talking about Reformation, we often think of just standing up on Mount Carmel. When we're talking about Reformation, we think of preaching a sermon. A powerful sermon that's going to shake everything. And too many times we preach in a way that actually pushes people away. What is the core work of Reformation? And I've heard this so many times. We receive emails. And I remember when I was beginning to work with the General Conference, I was living in Australia, and I get an email. A minister sends me an email. He forwards an email from a church member and sends me an email, sends us, the whole executive committee, an email and says, gives us a link on the internet and says, what are you going to do about this? Yeah, they sent me a... And I clicked the link, and it wasn't the best of photos, that's for sure. Had some issues there. And my response was, I'm going to do absolutely nothing. Because you are her pastor. Yeah, he was actually her pastor. And the person that sent that link was actually a neighbor, practically. They lived very close together. Wasn't the actual neighbor, okay, but they were in the same area. When we're talking about the work of Reformation, we have to talk about personal work. In 1 John 5:16, if any man see his brother sin a sin which is not unto death, he shall ask, and he shall give him life for them that sin not unto death. What is this talking about? When you see a brother sinning, what are you going to do? What does it say here? And he shall give him life. Who shall give him life?
The one that saw it.
The one that says it. We have a lot to pray for tonight. We talk about Reformation, whether we're talking about Reformation within our local churches, within our country or whatever else, or even in the land. The key to Reformation is giving life to those we see in sin. And this is a fundamental principle of Reformation. And we don't often think about that. When you look at Elijah's life prior to showing up with Ahab, viewing this apostasy from his mountain retreat, Elijah was overwhelmed with sorrow. In anguish of soul, he besought God to arrest the once favored people in their wicked course, to visit them with judgments if need be, that they might be led to see in its true light their departure from heaven. What was he doing? interceding for the people. We'll come to this a little bit later here. If not today, we'll get it back next prayer meeting. You know, we don't see this very visibly when you're looking at 1 Kings, the story of Elijah. But you know, Elijah was living where? Where was he living?
In the Mount Gilead.
Which mountains?
Gilead.
The mountains of Gilead. Therefore, you know, without saying it, because Jeremiah uses something really important to show what Elijah must have had. And what was that? Jeremiah 8:22. Is there no what? Balm where? In Gilead. That means that Elijah had something more than that standing up on the mountain Carmel. Elijah had more than coming to the king Ahab and saying, you know, there's not going to be dew or rain for the next until I tell you. He had something with him. And that's why it's important to look at the whole Bible. He had the balm of Gilead. You know, when we talk about reproof, and over the years I've heard different reasons for reproof, especially when we talk about discipline, church discipline, which is part of reproof. I keep hearing over and over again that more the idea of punishment rather than offering the balm of Gilead. It's interesting here. While he came to the people as a reprover of sins, his message offered the balm of Gilead to the sin-sick souls of all who desire to be healed. So Elijah's message was twofold. It gives reproof, and what else? He offers a solution. He offers something that will help people. As we look at this world that is going on out of control in one sense, and sometimes we can look at it all and say, yeah, well, people deserve this. Yeah, well, all deserve something. But are we praying for the balm of Gilead to sin-sick souls? Are we praying for that? Let's talk a little bit about praying for the erring. Like I said, we'll finish some of this next week, but let's just talk about that because we are here at prayer meeting. We have a lot of prayer requests. What about prayer for those who have missed something, left the truth? Some who are still in the church and they have left the truth, you know. That's also there. So when we see someone in error, what's the first thing we should do? You see someone is in error, you see someone's doing something wrong. What's the first thing we should be doing? Get to know them, pray for them. Pray for myself. That's an interesting one. We don't often have that in here. Let's just take a look at this statement here. It says here, confess your faults one to another and pray one for another that ye may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth not. It availeth much. It's quite interesting here. It says here, confess what? Who? This is something unique. I mean, we talk about, okay, if you sin, you need to confess your faults, yes, and we talk about that often. But what about the one who claims to be in the right? Do we confess our faults? You know, that's quite interesting. And what's the purpose of the prayer? That ye may be healed. Who? We're touching a little bit challenging ground here, eh? Who is to be healed? Does Elijah need to be healed?
Yeah.
It's not how we look at his story. You know, before Elijah came to Ahab, he spent a lot of time in his mountains praying. And after he talked to Ahab, what did he do for the next 3.5 years?
He was praying, interceding for the nation.
And what happened after Carmel? So what did he need to do? For who? We think about, I don't know, when we think of Reformation, we're so busy talking about everybody else along the way. I'd like to spend a little time thinking here about Elijah. He spent 3.5 years in solitude. It was not just, there was no live stream you can turn to listen to. He couldn't give out podcasts. He was in absolute silence for 3.5 years.
So was John.
John the Baptist, yeah. But I'm talking here, well, John the Baptist, after his message, he spent a few months in silence because he was there in the dungeon. I want you to think about this prayer here. What would Elijah be praying about? James 5:17, Elias was a man subject to like passions as we are, and he prayed earnestly. I just want to stop here for a moment. You know, why are praying earnestly and a man subject to like passions as we are in the same sentence? Why are those things there? And we assume he prayed earnestly for who? For those wicked people. And yet the Bible says he is a man subject to what? Like passions as we are. Therefore, what was he praying about?
For patience, not to lose it with them, not to lose his temper, compassion.
Not to be afraid too.
Yeah, all those things, but also, I mean, passions, you know. Obviously, he had some issues. So what do you think would be the most important part of his prayer? Because we're talking here about Reformation. We talk about, you know, standing up, pointing the sins of somebody out. You know, Galatians 6:1 always intrigued me. And you know, whenever I think of Galatians 6 verse 1 and I have to deal with a sin in the church, sometimes we have to deal with some pretty bad things. And then, as I'm dealing with it all, in the midst of dealing some things, I think of Galatians 6 verse 1. And what does it say? Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness. And notice the last part of it. Considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Now that's a tough one there. And like I said, I'm in the middle of dealing with a real serious problem. Person's gone through some You know, you wonder what type of evils they have. Some people have done some really evil things. And it's easy for us to sit there, wash it out, and say, oh, thank the Lord, we've caught this, and this person's out of the church. In the midst of that, I think of Galatians 6, verse 1. Elijah was what? A man of what? Of like passions. Therefore, why did it take 3.5 years before he shows up again? Do you think it was 3.5 years for him to deal with his own issues? What about us today? You know, we talk about the second coming of Christ, should have been a long time ago. And here we are, 2020, things are getting worse and worse. Have we actually taken the time to consider thyself, lest thou also be tempted? Or are we eager to purify the church? And sometimes it bothers me. Sometimes I find people, they're so eager to purify the church that their badge of honor is how many people they put on discipline rather than how many they baptized. That's a sad thing. Yeah, we need. Sometimes discipline is necessary. I understand that. But the question is, are we considering ourselves lest also we be tempted? If we're truly the spiritual ones, we will do a work of restoration, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. So what does that mean? Here's an interesting thing. In volume 5, when one errs, others too often feel at liberty to make the case appear as bad as possible. Those who perhaps are guilty of fully as great sins in some other direction will treat their brother with cruel severity. Okay, yeah, they're not guilty of the same thing. We understand that. But they may be guilty in the same degree of what? Of some other sin. And then they treat people with severity. Why? Because they haven't prepared themselves. We haven't prepared ourselves to deal with those who are having difficulties. And we often think of prayer meeting, pray for this one, pray for that one. What about praying for ourselves that when we go and talk to these people, because it's imperative that we go speak to them, not the minister, not somebody who doesn't know them, but we to go with them and pray with them. But we need to do first what? Pray for ourselves. Errors committed through ignorance, thoughtlessness, or weakness are exaggerated into willful, premeditated sin. As they see souls going astray, some fold their hands and say what? I told you so. I knew there was no dependence to be placed upon them. Thus they place themselves in the attitude of Satan, exulting in spirit that their evil surmisings have proven to be correct. This is a sad thing when we're talking about Reformation. When I look at some of these things, I get a different picture of Elijah. Especially when you read a man subject to what? Like passions as we are. For that reason, if we do not follow the process properly, what should happen? People sometimes tell me, well, it's a process, but that's still not the big issue. Well, let's look at the process. If we are not following the process properly, if we are not going to speak to the individuals involved, if we rather write an email identifying what's on Facebook and sending the link all around the world, yeah, and we don't go talk to the person. In the case I mentioned earlier, a couple years later, I met the person involved, and we had a good talk about it, some of the issues they're struggling with, and I asked if that minister ever talked to them personally. And again, he was their local pastor. He was the pastor of their church. And in 2 years, he didn't have time. But the link was shared where? Who knows where? Everywhere. It's gone all over the place. In reality, what does it say here? Evil speaking should be dealt with as a misdemeanor that is subject to church trial and separation from church membership if persisted in. For the church cannot be set in order in any other way. When we're talking about Reformation, it begins with my attitude. And I find that sometimes, when we're dealing with, oftentimes the two extremes in the church, you have conservatives, you have liberals, and I find that they have exactly the same ending result. A conservative person wants to purge the church, but they still won't go talk to the person in what we're talking about here. They don't talk. It's easier to stand up and preach against something than it is to go talk to the individual. And the liberal person simply says, there's nothing wrong with it, and they also don't want to talk to the person. And so what happens? Both actually get lost. Both are in the wrong. Bear in mind that the work of what? What is our burden? What is the Elijah message involving? Bear in mind the work of restoring is to be our burden. What is our work? Restoration. How do you do that? Elijah had to do it by identifying what the sin was, but what else? Clearly identifying what else did he have? What was it? And what was that called? The what? Where did he come from? Where did Elijah come from?
Gilead.
And what did he have?
Balm.
The balm of Gilead. Bear in mind that the work of restoring is to be our burden. This work is not to be done in a proud, officious, masterly way. Do not say, by your manner I have the power and I will use it, and pour out accusations upon the erring one. Do your restoring in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. So how do we do this? How do we actually go through this? Because, again, we obviously are praying for ourselves, and then we need to do something as well. How do we actually go through this? I'm going to have to leave that for next week. Well, our time is gone, but I think it's a really good spot to start because the next slide here is about Jesus and how Jesus worked it in his time and how, like I said, Elijah spent a lot of time, and I often thought it was just praying for everybody else, praying for the way to be opened up and everything else. And he had a lot of issues with himself. And even on the mount, after Mount Carmel, you think that this is it, and yet Elijah had a lot of issues. But I want to tell you something, even with all of his issues, because he wanted to see what was done right, what happened. Elijah was ready to die. He says, all right, I'm no better than anybody else. He saw himself really as he really was. And he says, I'm ready to die, and God says what? Elijah, I need you to come up here. I have something more for you. You're ready to die. After a little bit more time there, you got a few more things to deal with. I have a chariot ready for you. And that Elijah, who did that work, because it was done faithfully, he was able to still be alive today. Still hasn't gotten around to dying. It wasn't time for it yet. And may the Lord help us that as we're looking at the time of Reformation, really today, how Reformation is to be done in our lives, that we'll look at that next week and apply that a little bit more to our time.